He had gone in for the horse. The bay had thrown a shoe somewhere in the last mile, and Caleb Marsh had followed the tracks to the nearest property out of necessity rather than intention. Because that is what you do when an animal is lame on a mountain road in November and the temperature is falling and you are still 9 miles from home. The barn door was unlocked. The barn was dark. He went in. He found the horse first, someone's animal, not his. And then his eyes adjusted and he found the rest of it. She was in the far stall, in the straw, with her wrists bound to the post behind her by a length of chain and a padlock the size of a man's fist. She was a large woman, somewhere past 30, and she was looking at him without expression. Not the expression of someone who had stopped being afraid, but the expression of someone who had finished waiting for a thing that was not coming and had reorganized her expectations accordingly. Her dress was torn at the collar. Her lip had been split and healed and split again. She had a bruise across her left cheekbone that was at least 4 days old. She said, "Took you long enough." She said it the way a woman says something she has been waiting a long time to say and has rehearsed past the point of trembling. If this story already has you, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me. Because what Caleb Marsh does next in that barn in the mountains above Hardin Creek, Montana, in November of 1883, is going to shake every assumption that county has ever held about what a man is capable of and what a woman is worth. Her name was Ruth Ellery, and she had been in the barn for 9 days. She had come to Montana 6 weeks before that, from a boarding house in St. Paul where she had spent 2 years after her father's death, working as a seamstress and saving enough to answer an advertisement. Rancher, Hardin Creek, Montana Territory, seeks wife. Good prospects. Send reply to E. Voss, Box 14. She had sent her reply and her photograph. The photograph was a practical concession, and she had known when she sent it that it would do her no favors, because she was a broad-faced, full-figured woman whose face told the truth about her character and very little about what men who advertised for wives tended to have in mind. But she was 36 years old, and the boarding house was cold, and the advertisement had used the word prospects, which she took to mean something. Edmund Voss had met her at the rail depot in Billings. He had looked at her photograph and then at her person and made the calculation quickly, the way men of his particular type made calculations, entirely in his own favor, with no accounting for the other party. He had married her the following Tuesday, because the advertisement had not been the first one he'd placed, and the previous 2 wives had left after short intervals, and he had decided that the solution to the problem of wives who left was to ensure that the next one could not. She had understood what she had walked into on the 3rd day. She had begun planning to leave on the 4th. He had found the notes she had been writing, to herself, to no one. Just the practice of putting her situation into words, because words were the only thing she had always owned. And he had taken the pen, and then he had taken other things. And on the 9th day of October, he had chained her in the barn and told her she would stay there until she understood. She had been in the barn 9 days when Caleb Marsh came in for his horse. He did not waste time with questions she would answer later. He looked at the chain, he looked at the lock, and he went to the tool wall and found a bolt cutter, and he used it. The chain came apart. He coiled it and set it in the corner as though it were simply a piece of hardware that had been misapplied, which it was. And then he turned and offered her his hand. She looked at his hand. "My things are in the house," she said. "There's a carpet bag under the east bedroom floorboard, 3rd plank from the window. There's a tin box behind the kitchen woodpile with $11 and a promissory note my father left me. I need both of them before I leave." Caleb Marsh looked at her for a moment. His expression was the expression of a man updating his understanding of a situation in real time. "He in the house?" he said. "Billings?" she said. "He goes Thursdays. It's Thursday." He nodded. He went to the house. He came back with the carpet bag and the tin box and set them in front of her without inventory or comment. She put the tin box in the carpet bag. She stood, which took a moment. 9 days in the cold straw had done things to her joints that would take time to undo, and he did not reach for her arm, but he positioned himself close enough that she could reach for his if she wanted to. She did not want to. She had managed the standing herself. She picked up the carpet bag. "Where's your horse?" she said. "Rode," he said. "Through a shoe." "Then we're walking," she said, and she went out of the barn into the November cold without looking at the house. He fell into step beside her. His bay followed behind, patient about the whole business. They walked half a mile before either of them said anything. "I have a cabin," he said. "It's 9 miles. It's not much." "I've been in a barn for 9 days," she said. 9 miles is a direction, and not much is sufficient. They walked. Caleb Marsh ran a trapline in the upper timber above Hardin Creek, kept a kitchen garden in summer, and traded pelts in town twice a season in exchanges that involved the minimum necessary conversation. He was 44 years old and large in the way of men who have spent 20 years doing outdoor work without moderation, broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked carved from something that started larger. He had been a married man for 11 years before his wife, Elspeth, died of a fever in the spring of 1877, and a solitary man in the 6 years since, which had changed him in ways he understood and ways he did not. The cabin was small and well built and warm because he had spent the better part of 6 years making it so, and it smelled of pine and wood smoke and the particular deep warmth of a place that has been properly heated through many winters. There was one bed, which he gave her. There was a cot he pulled from under the workbench, which he took for himself. There was a stove, and he had it lit within 10 minutes of arriving, and there was a pot of dried bean soup he had been keeping since morning that he put on without asking if she wanted it. She did not sit. She stood by the stove and let the warmth work on her, and he watched her without watching her, the particular skill of a man who had spent years reading the forest for movement, and he saw the moment her shoulders came down. A fraction, the way a thing that has been braced against impact finally accepts that the impact is not coming. He ladled the soup. He handed it to her. She took it. She ate standing, because sitting still felt, just then, like something she was not ready to do. The soup was plain and hot, and there was a good quantity of it, and it tasted of salt and warmth and nothing more complicated than that, which was exactly what was needed. He cut bread from a loaf on the shelf and set it beside her without comment. She ate that too. "Edmund Voss," she said, "when the soup was done, will come home tomorrow from Billings." "Yes," Caleb said. "He will find the chain cut and me gone. Yes, he will come to town." She set down the cup. Her voice was even. She had 9 days of practice at keeping it even. "He will say things. He is the sort of man who is very accomplished at saying things." Caleb was quiet. "He will say I am disturbed," she said, "that I am ungrateful and irrational, and that the barn was for my own safety. He has said these things before, to other people about other situations. He has practiced at it." She looked at the fire. "He will not be believed by everyone, but he will be believed by some, and some is enough to make a difficulty." Caleb Marsh got up. He went to the shelf and took down a piece of paper and a pencil and set them on the table. "Write it down," he said. She looked at the paper. "What I told you." "All of it," he said. "Dates, what you found, what he did, what you saw and heard. He looked at the pencil, and then at her. Everything that happened since you arrived in Hardin Creek. If it's written in your hand and dated today, it's a record. She looked at him. I'm a trapper, he said. I know something about following things back to where they started. She sat down at the table. She picked up the pencil. She wrote for 40 minutes, which was how long it took to put 9 days and 6 weeks and 2 years in Saint Paul and the whole length of her life into the shape of a thing that could be read by a county judge, and Caleb sat across the room and kept the fire and did not read over her shoulder. When she finished, her hand was shaking, not from weakness, from the specific exhaustion of having held something at arm's length for 9 days and finally being allowed to set it down. She set the pencil down. He took the paper and folded it and put it in the tin box which she had left on the table, and he put the box in the carpet bag, and he said, "Sleep now. We'll go to town in the morning." "You don't have to come," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. She slept. It took her a long time to fall into it, because 9 days in a barn had taught her body not to trust stillness, but the fire held and the cabin was warm, and Caleb Marsh breathed steadily on his cot across the room with the reliability of a man who does not perform sleep, but simply does it, and eventually the steadiness of the place was more than the vigilance of her body, and she went under. She woke once, very late, to a banked fire and a star-crowded sky through the single window. She lay still and felt, with a precision that surprised her, that she was safe, not because danger was absent from the world, because it was not, but because there was a person in the room who had cut a chain off her wrists and walked 9 miles without once asking her to explain herself or be grateful in any particular way, and that was a specific and unfamiliar kind of safe, and her body knew the difference. She slept the rest of the night, without waking. Edmund Voss came back from Billings on the Friday, not the Thursday, because he had spent Thursday night at a card table and had lost most of what he'd gone to collect and needed the morning to reconstruct his dignity. He found the barn as Caleb had left it, the chain coiled in the corner, the stall empty, the padlock cut cleanly through. He was in Hardin Creek by mid-afternoon, and he was in the sheriff's office by 1:30, and he told the story he had prepared, which was well constructed and internally consistent and entirely his. Ruth Ellery was a troubled woman, he said, volatile, prone to fabrications. The chain had been a necessity, a temporary measure, he said, to protect her from herself. He had witnesses who could speak to her instability. There was the station master in Billings who had seen her behavior on the platform. There was the neighbor woman, Mrs. Flint, who would confirm that Ruth had been agitated and difficult from the first week of the marriage. He was a good talker, Edmund Voss. He had survived 2 previous wives by being a very good talker. What he had not accounted for was the tin box. Caleb Marsh came into the sheriff's office at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and he set the tin box on the sheriff's desk, and he did not say anything except she wrote it down. Sheriff Aldred, who had been listening to Edmund Voss for 40 minutes and had the expression of a man who is holding 2 versions of a story up to the light and looking for which one is made of glass, opened the tin box and read for 15 minutes. Then he read it again. Then he set it down. "Miss Voss," he said. Voss began to speak. "Mr. Voss," the sheriff said again, in the tone of a man who has decided the conversation is over and is providing this information to the room. "I'm going to need you to stay where you are." The room, by then, was not small. Word had moved through Hardin Creek in the way that word moves in a town of 200 souls when something worth knowing is happening at the sheriff's office on a Friday afternoon. There were 11 people in the office and another 8 standing outside the door, which was open. And one of them was Mrs. Aldred, who was there ostensibly to bring her husband his supper, but was there actually because Mrs. Flint, Voss's witness, was her neighbor. And Mrs. Aldred had been watching Mrs. Flint for years, and she had known something was wrong at the Voss property since July, and she had not known how to say so until Ruth Ellery's 40 minutes of pencil work on a pine table in a mountain cabin gave her the shape of the thing she had been looking at. She said so in the sheriff's office, in front of 11 people and Edmund Voss, in a voice that did not shake. Then Ruth walked through the door. She had changed into the clean dress from the carpet bag and pinned her hair, and she had covered the bruise on her cheekbone with nothing, because she had nothing to cover it with, and because it was, in any case, not hers to hide. She had asked Caleb, on the road into town, whether she looked presentable. He had said, "You look like someone who has been through something and come out the other side of it." She had said that would have to do. She came into the room and she looked at Edmund Voss, and she did not look away from him. And the room felt the particular quality of a silence that happens when the subject of a story walks into the room where the story is being told. Voss looked at her, and his expression did the thing it did when a plan encountered reality, a brief, controlled adjustment, a tightening. And then he looked at the sheriff and said, "You can see what I mean about her." Ruth Ellery reached into her carpet bag and set a second document on the sheriff's desk. She had been writing on the ride into town, in the wagon, in Caleb's careful hand after hers had steadied. It was the promissory note, and beside it, in her own writing, a record of the advertisement, the marriage date, the date the pen was taken, the dates of each occasion she could name, and the names of 3 women in St. Paul who knew her history and could be written to for confirmation. "I am not disturbed," she said. She said it to the room, not to Voss, to the 11 people, and to the 8 in the doorway, and to Mrs. Aldred, who nodded once, slowly, the nod of a woman who has been waiting for this sentence to be spoken by someone with the standing to speak it. "I am a seamstress from St. Paul with a promissory note from my father and 3 character witnesses and 40 minutes of dated testimony written in a cabin 9 miles from here on the night I was removed from a locked stall where I had been kept for 9 days. I am not disturbed. I am angry, which is a different thing, and anyone who has read what is on that desk has good reason to be angry alongside me." The room was very quiet. Then Caleb Marsh, who had been standing to her left since she walked in and who had not said a word since he put the tin box on the desk, said, in the even, unhurried tone of a man who has decided what he thinks and sees no reason to dress it up, "She's telling the truth. I found her. I'll say so in front of any judge in Montana." Edmund Voss opened his mouth. Sheriff Aldred held up one hand. Voss was held overnight and bound over for the circuit judge, who came through Hardin Creek in December and found the matter straightforward. The promissory note was returned. The marriage was dissolved on grounds that required the judge to use language he had not previously been called upon to employ in Hardin Creek, Montana, and which he employed with an expression of controlled fury that the court recorder noted in the margin. 3 letters arrived from St. Paul within the month. Mrs. Flint, to her credit, retracted her statement before she was asked to, which the sheriff noted was the most useful thing she had done in the matter, coming as it did without prompting. Edmund Voss left Hardin Creek in January, which was not far enough for most people's satisfaction, but was the maximum the law could provide, and they accepted it because the law was what they had. Ruth Ellery stayed. Not in the cabin. At first, she took a room above the dry goods store, where the owner's wife, Mrs. Holt, had offered one on terms that were fair. Because Mrs. Holt had been in the sheriff's office on the Friday and had decided that her property could be used in better ways than storage. Ruth sewed. She had brought her needles and her good shears in the carpet bag, alongside everything else, because she was a woman who knew what her hands were worth and packed accordingly. By February, she had 3 paying customers. By March, she had 6. Caleb came to town on his twice-seasonal trading visits, and then, as winter turned, on visits that did not coincide with trading. He brought her a haunch of venison in December that she made into a stew that lasted 4 days and improved with each one. He brought a length of good wool in January that she made into a coat, and then, as an afterthought, into a second coat for him, because his own was 20 years old and argued against continued use. He tried it on in the dry goods store with the expression of a man encountering good workmanship and not knowing what to do about being moved by it. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said, and she hemmed the left sleeve because it was a 1/4 inch too long and she was constitutionally incapable of leaving a 1/4 inch unaddressed. She went to his cabin in March because he had asked her to see the kitchen garden she had offered to help him put in when the ground thawed. She walked through the rooms, spare and warm, and organized in the way of a man who values function and has no one to perform beauty for, and she thought about what she had survived and what she had arrived at, which required, she was finding, the same discipline as any other difficult thing: attention, patience, and the willingness to stay in it long enough to see what it became. She stood at the window that faced the south slope, and Caleb stood beside her, and the silence between them had the quality it had been developing all winter. Not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say, but of 2 people who have said enough that the silences are now carrying information on their own. "The advertisement," she said. "The one Voss placed. Before I answered it, I almost wrote to a different one." "What was it?" he said. "Trapper, mountain cabin, 8 years on his own, Bear Creek area." She looked at the slope. "I thought the mountains were too far." He was quiet a moment. "I placed that in 1882, he said. Nobody answered. She turned and looked at him. His expression had the quality of a man who has spent 6 years alone and is finding, unexpectedly, that tolerance and hope are not the same thing, and that he has apparently not run out of the second one after all. "That is a remarkable coincidence," she said. "Or an argument," he said, "that some things take the time they take." He paused. "Ask me again in the spring whether I think it was a coincidence. I'll have a better answer then." She turned back to the window. 3 weeks, she said, "until the ground is soft enough." 3 weeks, he agreed. Outside, the south slope held its snow with the patience of a mountain that has no interest in anyone's schedule. And inside the cabin it was warm and still, and neither of them moved from the window for some time. They married in May, in Hardin Creek, in front of more people than either of them had invited, because an invitation list implies there are people you are not inviting. And Caleb Marsh had never quite determined how to draw that line, and Ruth had found, to her surprise, that the town had developed an investment in how the story ended. Mrs. Aldred came. Mrs. Holt closed the dry goods store for the morning, which she had not done since her husband's funeral. The sheriff came and brought his wife, and when the minister asked whether anyone knew a reason the 2 should not be joined, Aldred looked at the room with the expression of a man who would enjoy the opportunity to discuss that question. And the room was sufficiently aware of this that the silence that followed was the most cooperative silence Hardin Creek had produced in years. Caleb said his words in the careful way of a man who has been preparing them since March and will not use one that is not exactly right. Ruth said hers in the clear voice she had recovered from the barn and had not put down since. Outside, through the open church door, the mountains were where they always were, enormous and old and entirely indifferent to ceremony, and the spring was well underway, and the kitchen garden at the cabin had gone in the week before, and the seedlings were already showing. What Caleb Marsh had done that November in the barn had shocked people the way simple things shock people when they encounter them in circumstances that have stopped expecting simplicity. He had gone in for a horse and found a woman in chains and cut the chain and walked 9 miles in the cold and given her his bed and kept his fire. He had put a tin box on a sheriff's desk and said 4 words and meant all of them. The county had watched all of it, because the county had been watching since the sheriff's office and could not seem to stop. What they had been watching, they understood by May, was not a rescue. It was a recognition. He had gone into the barn and seen a woman who had organized her survival with the precision of someone who had never stopped believing she was worth the effort, and he had recognized what that was. Because he had spent 6 years recognizing it in himself. She had come out of that stall and asked for her carpet bag and her tin box and started walking, and he had fallen into step, and they had walked the same direction ever since. Ruth Ellery Marsh did not require the town to apologize for what it had been slow to see. She required it to see clearly now, which it did. She required her work to be paid at the rate it was worth, which it was. She required the room at the end of the day to be warm and quiet, and inhabited by a man who was capable of the one thing she had not known she was looking for. He was capable of paying attention. She had been worth attending to all along. A few people in that church had understood it since November, standing in a barn doorway, watching a woman in a torn dress ask a stranger for her carpet bag before she agreed to be saved. She had known her own value, even then. Even in the chain and the cold and the 9 days. She had rehearsed the sentence. She had been waiting for someone to walk through the door who would understand what it meant. Took you long enough. He had.